Welcome to Geometry, Section 15B. It's still angle relationships. It's all those angles that we've talked about. However, we're going to do two specific things in the second part of this section, which is to talk about making assumptions and then word problems. Everybody loves a good word problem. So, I don't want to take a ton of time talking about making assumptions, but here's the big part of this. Unless angles or segments, those two big things, are marked or specified in the directions. So either you've got congruence or betweenness of points or any of those kinds of things. It's got to be either marked or, I keep telling you, read the directions because geometry slips things into the directions. You cannot assume that things are congruent or perpendicular. Don't make the assumption. So I've got this little diagram in here, and if you look at this, you can assume that things are coplanar. All those points and lines and rays are on the same plane. We can assume that G, H, and J are collinear. However, we can't assume things like this angle is congruent to that angle. It's not marked or specified. We can't assume that this is a right angle. It's not marked or specified. So you have to be kind of a skeptic. You have to really look for things to tell you. We can't assume that this is an angle bisector, which would make those two angles congruent. So you have to be told somehow that things are congruent or perpendicular. It could be in a sneaky way. It could say angle bisector, which makes you know that things are congruent. It could be segment bisector, which means you know two things are congruent. So you just have to be really skeptical. You can't make assumptions on perpendicular or congruent. So in this one, it says determine whether each statement can be assumed from the figure. So if I asked you if LPM and MPO are adjacent angles. So first of all, let me identify those angles. LPM is this angle. MPO, whoops, I went too far. That's a Q. Let me find my highlighter again. MPO are those adjacent angles. So remember, I said in the last lesson, you just have to know some of this terminology. Adjacent angles means they share a vertex, P, and a side, ray PM. So yes, you know that. That's obvious. It's happening. Then it says LPM. So I'll keep that yellow highlighting there. I'll just move this. LPM and LP or OPQ. OPQ are complementary. Do you remember what complementary means? Complementary means two angles add up to 90 degrees. Hopefully you thought that same thing. Are OPQ and LPM complementary? No. What if I changed this and said those two angles, OPQ and LPM, are congruent? Can you make that assumption? Notice I've got these guys right here. What do those tell you? They tell you congruent. It's marked, so we could say yes. If those weren't marked like that, even though they look like they're probably the same measure, we could not make the assumption. All right, so you're getting the idea of what that looks like. So you have to be skeptical. I'm kind of going fast through those because I want to just make sure that you see, and I'm going to tell you a lot of times, does it tell you that they're congruent? Does it tell you these other things? So just be really careful, watch out for those. Let's talk about word problems. We've got some steps to solve word problems. First thing that I'm going to ask you to do every single time is to draw and label your diagram. It's not like you haven't heard that before. The second thing I'm going to ask you to do is to set up an equation using your given information. And then obviously solve, and there is always a built-in double check. There's no excuse for you to get these wrong if you use the double check. So draw and label your diagram, set up your algebraic equation, and then solve and check. So this is what a problem will look like. Number 6, it says, find the measure of two complementary angles if the difference in the measure of the two angles is 12. Looks a bit overwhelming to start, right? Well, let's take this step by step. Let's set ourselves up a diagram. In order to know what kind of diagram to draw, you have to know things. You need to know what complementary angles look like. Complementary angles always add up to 90 degrees. So I'm going to draw and label, even if you're a terrible drawer, that's a terrible drawing. If you label it as 90 degrees, remember we can't make the assumption unless we have it labeled. And I know that there's two angles, they're complementary angles. So far, so good. Now let's get some stuff on there. It says the difference in the measures of the two angles is 12. Well, we don't know either one of these angles, so always start with marking one as X first. We don't know the first one, we're good. Difference, go back to your algebra. Difference always tells you subtract, right? So one is 12 littler than the other one. So it's got to be 12 littler, 12 fewer degrees than the other. We are done drawing and labeling that diagram. So you're looking for keywords. That's really what word problems are all about. Math is looking for those keywords that tell you without shouting out, giving you the problem. So we know that complementary angles add up to 90 degrees. But what are the two angles that we drew and labeled? X is the one angle and x minus 12 is the other angle. Equation to solve, we got this. Combine like terms, 2x minus 12 equals 90. I'm going to add 12 to both sides, and I'm going to end up with 2x equals 102. Divide by 2, and I believe that would be a 51. Notice the words. I keep trying to say this over and over again. It says to find the measure of two angles. So I know that this guy equals 51. What does the other one have to be equal to? Well, 51 minus 12, right? Because I'm going to substitute that x value in there. So what is that, like 39 or something? So my two angles are 51 and 39. So we drew and labeled, we set up the equation, and then we solve and check. Because we knew what complementary was, we knew what the drawing looked like, we also knew what the equation looked like. We knew that keyword difference means subtract. We've got ourselves an equation. Let's do number 7. Find the measure of two supplementary angles if one angle is 42 degrees larger than the other. First thing, draw and label a diagram. It probably would be helpful if you looked back or already had memorized what supplementary means. Supplementary means two angles that add up to 180 degrees. So 180 degrees looks like a straight line, vertex. I've got myself two supplementary angles. It's drawn, now I need to label it. First angle, I don't know. Let's call it X. It does not matter if X ends up being drawn smaller but a bigger value. It's all just to organize that information. So this is my first angle, and then it says one angle is 42 degrees larger than the other. So this one must be 42 degrees larger than X. I've got myself a diagram. Now, hopefully, it's shouting at you, telling you what to do. Supplementary means two angles add up to what? 180, which is exactly how we drew it. What are the two angles that we labeled on our diagram? X plus 42 plus X. Combine like terms, 2x plus 42. I'm going to subtract 42 from both sides. And 2x equals, what is that, 138? Divide both by 2. If I'm doing my math too fast, or if you need time to just process it, hit stop, do the math problem, and then make sure that you got the same answer as I did. Don't just scribble a bunch of stuff down and you don't know where it came from. I know sometimes it's hard to think and write at the same time. So we just figured out that x equals 69. Notice the problem says find the measure of two angles. So we found the measure of the first. We need to find the measure of the second. Well, we're going to substitute that value in there. So 69 plus 42. So my first angle is 69 degrees. The other one ends up being, what, 111? Somebody stop me if I'm wrong. Built-in double check. I forgot to say that on the last problem. 69 plus 111 should add up to 180. Otherwise, we did the problem wrong. If I go back to this one, 51 plus 39 should be 90 degrees. If not, I did something wrong. So there's always a built-in double check. Again, there's no reason for you to get those wrong. All right, that is it for section 1.5b. We get to do some practice word problems, our favorite things. We'll see you next time.